Welcome to another video with Scruffy Tales. As the world nervously awaits Ukraine's counteroffensive to kick into motion, I figured I would share my thoughts on where it might occur and the reasons why. I first thought about this back in February, having coffee one morning, and it was basically a fun thought experiment. Where would I attack Russia if I was in charge of the Ukrainian troops? So I doodled on my phone on a screenshotted map. My reasoning back then hasn't really changed, to be honest. I still think what I took into consideration at the time is relevant, even now, a couple of months later on. As I see it, that is. Being a total random dude on the internet and basically talking out of my ass, since I have no knowledge on how the logistical side of things is looking for Ukraine, and I don't have any access to Ukrainian intelligence on Russian positions. But despite all of this, I still think that Ukraine has 5 points of interest along the front line for their counter-offensive. And I believe these 5 main points of interest for Ukraine are Bakhmut, Donetsk, Mariupol, Melitopol, and Kherson. Bakhmut, because of the political importance and the immense propaganda victory it would be to reclaim it. Taking Bakhmut, or rather the surrounding area, would also allow Ukraine to potentially push Russia back towards Luhansk. Donetsk, because it is a regional capital, it is right on the front line, and that too would be a huge propaganda victory. And from Donetsk you can head for the Russian border and also cut off Mariupol. Kherson, because it would allow Ukraine to stage attacks against Crimea. This is a dangerous operation, however, since it involves an amphibious assault across the Dnieper River, and that involves great risks. The incredible risks involved makes me think that if this happens, it will not be as an isolated attack, but it will come in tandem with another bigger push over land. But the two really interesting and important locations are Mariupol and Melitopol, because they are both the key to holding on to southern Ukraine, and in the long run, key to holding on to Crimea. But more on that later on. First, let's take a look at how easily Russia can send in troops and equipment to the various parts of Ukraine. We can clearly see that Russia has a far easier time reaching Bakhmut and Donetsk with reinforcements, even Mariupol. The Donbass is firmly in Russian control, and roads and railways into Russia allows for Russian reinforcements and equipment to be easily transported from Russia into Ukraine and the Donbass along the entire length of the Russian border. If Ukraine attacks into the regions of Luhansk and Donetsk, Russia already has a lot of troops in place, a lot of logistics in place, and a lot of artillery in place. The Russian Air Force and missile batteries located within Russia can also a lot easier support the frontline troops in facing the Ukrainian offensive. So, despite the meat grinder at Bakhmut, we cannot rule out Russia and its capabilities in the Donbass. It will be a tough fight for Ukraine attacking in the east, because it is here Russia has its most hardened veterans after the hard fighting taking place this winter and spring. It is here Russia has amassed a lot of its artillery, and it is here the Russian Air Force can truly support the ground battle without taking too many risks going up against Ukrainian missiles. Reaching Kherson and Melitopol is a bit trickier for Russia, since those reinforcements has to come from Crimea, and Russia can only reach Crimea over a single bridge located outside of the map to the south. Or they have to come all the way from Mariupol and the two main supply routes in the southeast. It is also much more difficult for Russian aircraft to assist the ground units at Melitopol and Kherson. So here is where Russia is the least able to mount a proper defense. They have the least troops gathered, they have the longest and most vulnerable chain of logistics, and little air support. Looking at where Russia has most of its troops located, that we know of, one should add, we can clearly see that Bakhmut and Donetsk would be very difficult for Ukraine to attack, and that attacking in the south would be an easier task, just by looking at manpower alone. And Russia appears to have realized this as well, and we have seen multiple reports of Russia heavily fortifying for several months the area between the front and the city of Melitopol, as well as the road from Tokmak to Berdyansk. And there's a reason for this. Russian forces in the south of Ukraine relies on four main supply routes, two from Crimea in the south and two from the east. The road via Mariupol to Melitopol that follows the coastline of the Azov Sea, and the railroad coming from Donetsk and going to Kakhovka. If Ukraine could reach the supply routes between the east and Melitopol at any point, then that would severely affect Russia's ability to resupply and reinforce its troops trying to hold on to the territory around Crimea, Melitopol and Kherson. If compared to the Donbass, Ukraine does not have the same opportunity to cut off Russian supplies, and even cut off Russian troops from the rest of the Russian army. I believe, and many others do too as it appears, including Russia by the looks of it, that Ukraine will attack in the south. And I base it on that Russia does not have as many hardcore veterans in the south. The Russian Air Force is not able to assist in the battles to the same extent. Russian logistics and supplies are very vulnerable to Ukrainian attacks, and Ukraine stands a good chance of cutting off Russian units from any reinforcements. On top of that, all throughout this winter and spring, we have seen reports of Ukrainian special forces and partisans conducting one successful sabotage after the other in the south against the Russian occupation forces. Elite soldiers and patriotic Ukrainians are already in place and ready to fight in the south, ready to support an eventual offensive by harassing Russian units in the rear and ready to ambush Russian supply lines. Do I think that Ukraine will try and attack Mariupol? I'm not so sure. Ukraine would have to fight their way through some heavily defended Russian positions at the front, and Russia has plenty of troops nearby that can quickly reinforce positions and even counterattack. Mariupol is close to the Russian border and close to Russian troops in the Donbass. Russia could successfully defend Mariupol, if you ask me, or Ukraine would pay too heavy a price in order to reach the city and secure it. So heavy they might not be able to hold on to their gains. Now, all reports indicate that Russia has focused a lot of energy on securing Melitopol and the roads leading to it from the front. And for good reason. Between the river to the north of and the bay south of Melitopol, you have a narrow stretch of land that Ukraine could occupy and thereby cut off Russian forces in the west from Russian support in the east. Russia obviously has no intentions of letting Ukraine attack this vital territory unopposed. With Melitopol and Mariupol being so well defended, and Bakhmut and Donetsk being where Russia has amassed most of its troops, that leaves Ukraine with one last point to attack, at Poloi, in order to reach Berdyansk and Primorsk. And this is what I think Ukraine will try and achieve, reaching the shores of the Sea of Azov by securing Primorsk and possibly, if doable, Berdyansk. Berdyansk could be difficult as it is used as a Russian base of operations with barracks and an airfield. But in general, this is what I think we will see in the end. If Ukraine secures Poloi and Chernihivka to its south, they cut off the vital railroad, and reaching the sea, They cut off the main roads leading to the west. As you can tell from this picture, it's a risky move to try and push all the way to the sea, and it leaves Ukraine vulnerable to counterattacks. It means they have to try and attack to the west and east while still pushing south, in order to keep the Russians from closing the front line behind Ukrainian troops. No easy task. But if Ukraine pulls it off, then large portions of Russian troops will be cut off from reinforcements and supplies. If successful, I think Ukraine will then start to push Russia back towards Crimea. I don't think Ukraine will repeat Russia's mistake at Bakhmut, so they will simply contain Russian troops in Melitopol, waiting to liberate the city at a later date, possibly doing the same with Tokmak, at least initially. Ukraine does not want to get stuck in a bunch of meat grinders unless they truly have to. I suspect that they have learned their lesson from Bakhmut. The terrain is difficult enough, with several rivers and lots of wide open farmland. Ukraine will have to fight hard to push through prepared Russian defenses and will have to fight their way along narrow tree lines and over rivers and bridges. We would do well to remember that even if Russia has two main supply routes coming in from Crimea, we must not forget that there is only one supply route by land from Russia to Crimea itself, the Kerch Bridge, the very bridge that Ukraine sabotaged so famously. If Ukraine manages to sabotage this vital bridge once more, then the Russian troops in the west will be cut off from supplies and reinforcements. Sure, you can move in stuff with ships, but that is not as reliable as trains and trucks, especially as Ukraine has demonstrated that they can attack Russian warships with unmanned kamikaze boats. I think we can assume that attacking cargo ships and troop transports carrying military equipment and reinforcements over the sea is within Ukraine's capabilities. The Kerch Bridge is absolutely vital for Russia's war effort in and around Kherson, Melitopol, and Crimea. I suspect that the Kerch Bridge will see a lot of attacks and several attempts to either bring it down in full or sabotage it severely, or even just enough to make logistics a little bit more difficult to coordinate for the Russians. Another thing that I think speaks in favor of an attack in the south around Polowy is the recent incursions into Belgorod and Ukrainian probes over the Dnieper River. These events will clearly force Russia to move troops away from the front lines or from their reserves in order to reinforce the Russian extreme flanks. With more Russian troops out on the flanks, the easier it will be to attack somewhere in the middle. Why not, in that case, attack where Russia is the weakest? Possibly at Polowy, for instance. And I think, and hope, that by the end of summer the maps will show something like this, with Russia heavily pushed back in the south, defending the two exit points to Crimea, probably defending a surrounded Melitopol that is running low on ammunition and supplies, and possibly defending Berdyansk if Ukraine did not manage to secure it early on. I think there's also a good chance that Ukraine might try and cross the Dnieper somewhere along the river to outflank the Russians if they do attack along the southern front. It would force Russia to split up their forces, and it could force Russia to fall back completely all the way back to Crimea if Ukraine is lucky enough and their offensive progresses as they hope. But let's not pretend as if this will be easy by any means. This will most likely be a very bloody affair that will be a costly endeavor for Ukraine. But hopefully it will be worth it. Attacking in the south is the most obvious move. It is where Russia has the fewest troops, the longest supply chains, the most difficult in reinforcing and resupplying units, and so on. And Ukraine can cut off Russian units from Russia and begin to systematically grind them down. Which is why we actually might see Ukraine attacking somewhere else, simply because it is the most obvious choice to attack in the south. Ukraine might attack through Bakhmut and attempt to liberate Luhansk, maybe surround Donetsk and then attack south to Mariupol. And they might do this simply because it is not obvious or expected, gambling that Russia has allocated its supplies and reinforcements to fight in the south. Or perhaps there will be an attack to retake Bakhmut, simply to force Russia to allocate troops to that battle, instead of the real offensive that could be trying to cut off Melitopol, forcing Russia to split its forces and resources between the south and the east. We will see, but I'm going to stick my chin out and predict that Ukraine will attack in the south with a main offensive, and they will try and reach Primorsk and Berdyansk, and simply surround and cut off Melitopol in the long run. And let's hope that Russia is not planning on a sneaky counterattack as Ukraine is pushing deep into Russian-held territory. They probably are, to be honest, but how likely are they to succeed, judging with how their main big offensive earlier this year utterly failed? Jokes aside, wherever Ukraine decides to attack, it will be difficult, people will die, and it will be horrifying. And it will take time. It won't be over in a week. It will be a long, hard struggle. But in the end, hopefully, Western armor and equipment will allow Ukraine to force Russia to retreat and leave the country for good. But Ukraine must be careful so that Russia is not successful in cutting off Ukrainian troops that have overextended their reach. Any territorial gains must be secured and breaches in the Russian lines must be widened so they can't be closed by a Russian counterattack. So what are the implications of Ukraine succeeding in the south? Well, it would put Crimea in direct risk of being the next target. Ukraine would make sure the Kerch Bridge would be destroyed and unusable, leaving Crimea as good as isolated from Russia. And Russia will not let this happen. Crimea is too important strategically, and Putin has made it clear on multiple occasions that he considers Crimea to rightfully belong to Russia. If Ukraine manages to reclaim Crimea, it would be a truly humiliating defeat for Putin and the Russian army. If Ukraine succeeds in the south, I believe that Russia will put great effort into fortifying Crimea, fortifying it even further than they already have done. And with all the troops that Russia will deploy to Crimea in order to secure it, it will leave Russia vulnerable elsewhere, and it will give Ukraine the opportunity to fully liberate the Donbass. If Ukraine attacks Crimea, I think they will do so towards the end of the war, after the rest of the country has been liberated. And the battle for Crimea will be one hell of a fight if I'm right about this. This is to 90% based on thoughts I had back in February when I was having a cup of coffee in the morning and started thinking about where Ukraine might actually counterattack. So this was a simple look at my thoughts on the matter, and if you disagree or have any other thoughts, please share them in the comment section. Where and how do you think Ukraine will unleash the counteroffensive? I'm looking forward to seeing your thoughts on it all, and with that, I'll see you around. Gå på marsch, Ukraine, and give them hell.